Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D. And judging by this title, could this be the last ever property podcast? Have we completely changed and flipped our ideas on property and now no longer believe in it? Let's find out.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. Doesn't sound inspiring, does it? Property being a terrible way to make money? But there's a lot of value in this week's episode. We're going to give you a new way of thinking about the power of property. And stick around to the end because we're going to give you a load of other money-making ideas as well. Time now for this week's news story. And I've actually got a really good one that came across this week, but I'm going to save it. I'm saving it for next week's market update because we could have a good chat about that one. But an interesting one for now as well comes from Landlord Zone. And it's the report that last year, 50% of buy-to-let mortgages went to limited companies. 50%. So that is such a shift when you think about it. Like, we've been used to seeing the number creeping up, and it's been getting more every year. And if you'd asked me what a figure was, I would have come up with a high number, but I don't think I would have said half. That is such a shift over the space of like 5 years or so. Because before all the tax changes of 2016, 17, whenever it was, it just wasn't even a thing that people thought about. Everyone just bought in their own name. And obviously there are good reasons why that has shifted. And that's often the right decision for people to make. But the fact that it's got to 50% is just absolutely huge. This report does say that this is probably the high watermark for various reasons. One reason that it hasn't listed, but I think may be effect, is that because last year was a weird year, perhaps you had more of the amateur buyers sitting on the sidelines, not sure what was going on, where more serious buyers, to generalise, were getting involved in the market. And you therefore had a higher than usual proportion of company mortgages. But still, that is a big, big number. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes over future years. I think we might be upsetting a few people with today's topic. We're already going to be upsetting a few people because it sounds like clickbait. I mean, why property is a terrible way of making money? Then why have we been doing the property podcast for all these years? And have we suddenly seen the light? Are we suddenly about to change it to the index fund investing podcast? Well, no, it's not that at all. Property really is a terrible way of making money in many circumstances. So in this episode, we're going to dig deeper into that statement and explain ourselves a bit. And in the course of that, also explain why the property podcast is not ending as a result.
Phew, that's good to hear, Rob, because I feel like the last however many years, getting up at 7 o'clock and recording every Monday might have been a bit of a waste of time. So I'm pleased to hear that we are going to carry on. Now, for this episode, we're going to cover some different strategies that you can take on through property and explain why, as a way to make money, it's not very good. So we will, at the end, have a good chat. And I think that's going to be really interesting once we've been through the strategies, to listen to that conversation. Because, of course, we'll explain why it's not a good way to make money. And in fact, you could class it as terrible. But also give you far easier ways of making money as well. So we're not just going to tell you why it's no good and then leave you to it. We'll actually give you direction of how you can make money as well if you want to. So this podcast could have been really clickbaity because it could have been a terrible way to make money, but here's how to make money. I probably would have got loads more downloads, but hey-ho, here we are. So let's start this off. Let's go through the different property strategies that you can take on and explain why, as a way of making money, at least, it's not that effective.
Yeah, so take this concept and make it a bit more real. Let's consider a particular objective. It's a really common objective as well, which is make an extra £2,000 a month. It's not just a number we've completely picked out the air. It's when you speak to people who are looking at getting into property, that is one of the most common objectives that comes up. A lot of people want an extra £2,000 a month. And I think they pick that number because it's like small enough that it feels achievable, but large enough that it kind of makes a difference. So maybe with that, you could drop down to part-time. Or if you've got a partner and you're both working, one of you could stop. Or it's just a meaningful extra amount of money that you could use to improve your lifestyle. So an extra £2,000 a month is a great goal when you're first getting started, and it's a goal for a lot of people. But here's the problem. Property really is a terrible way of going about achieving that goal. So let's look at why that's the case by considering some of the main approaches that people use. So let's start with the most bog standard version of buy-to-let you could possibly have. You just buy properties, do nothing with them, don't do anything clever, rent them out, rental income comes in, that's it. This is a strategy that we love because it's safe, it's predictable, it does get great results over the long term. But in terms of actually getting to that goal of making £2,000 a month, it's a shocker, because to achieve that based on the typical yield that you'd expect from a property, assuming that you're not going to be reinvesting anything or buying at a discount or any of that, which you could of course do to reduce this amount, but without doing any of that, you'd need over £250,000. And that is kind of insane as a way to make money. It's like, oh yeah, I want to make a bit of money. How do I start? Well, I'll just invest the 250,000 I've already got. If you are sitting on that kind of capital, you're probably not having these kind of conversations. So as a way to make money, it's a terrible one because it requires you to have a vast amount of money to start with. Of course, we are only talking about the income side of property here. We recorded an episode called The Total Return Formula, where we talk a lot about the importance of capital growth as well. So you should go and listen to that episode if you haven't done already. And yes, that is great, but it doesn't help you out with that initial goal. If you are going to refinance your portfolio, for example, to tap into some of that growth, well, that's going to take years. And you probably don't want it to take years. And if you are chasing this objective to make some kind of meaningful change in your lifestyle, like I talked about, you're probably not going to want to be waiting years. So, Rob, buy-to-let is not the only strategy. There are others available. And it's just as well, because clearly it is not a good way of hitting that goal.
No, it's not. It's not a good way of hitting that goal. It's fantastic at something else, which we'll come to. But as a way of just making instant income, buy-to-let is not effective. So if the old faithful buy-to-let, which is what the vast majority of the people who listen to the property podcast do, if that isn't effective for making money and you want to make money, what other property options do you have? Well, everything else is more hands-on. So let's look at that. So next on the list is refurb refinance, where you buy a property that needs some sort of work. It may be cosmetic or structural. It may be a bigger job. And you spend your time on that project and you improve the property. Hopefully, if it's gone right, you add value. And then that allows you to refinance. And in this example, you're going to keep the property and then reinvest the capital into another project. So that first property will then give you rental income. And then you go on and do the next project. Now, this definitely speeds things up, but it's hard to do. Make no mistake about it. It's easy to fire off a line or two on a podcast and go, buy a property, do it up, refinance it, take money out, and then do it again and carry on and carry on. And eventually you'll have a big enough portfolio that'll give you a big enough rental income that you'll have your 2K a month. First of all, you need capital to start with on your first project. So you might not have the 250K. So maybe that's why you do this strategy, so you can build the portfolio up. But realistically, for most people, doing one of these projects a year is the max. Now, there'll be people listening who are able to allocate more time or have a team or are all in on property and they can do this full time, but most people can't. So you have this one project a year, which is stressful. You might be good at dealing with stress, and I think you have to be to go and do this strategy because lots of things will go wrong. It's just part of the game. If you do this strategy, then every year you have to endure another refurb project. And yes, your goal may be so important to you that you're prepared to do it, but it's going to take a while to get to where you need to be. It's going to take a lot of refurb projects for you to get to the point where you're earning enough rental income from your portfolio to make that 2K a month. So it's not dismissing it as a strategy entirely, far from it. Again, to repeat, we will talk about the benefits of property at the end. We're not slamming all strategies here. There are reasons why these strategies can be effective. But as a way of hitting our target of 2K a month, it's not very effective at all.
No, what you said, Rob, there is really important. We are not just slating every individual property strategy. We're doing it in respect to this goal. Refurb refinance can be great. It's just not for this particular objective. And exactly the same for what we're going to cover next, which is doing flips. So you buy a property, refurb it, but rather than doing what we were talking about before, which was refinancing it so you could release cash to go again, you sell that property and pocket the cash and use that to live off. Now, the benefit of flips is that it is pretty quick as things go. So let's say that you executed a 6-month project and you made a profit of £20,000. Well, then on a monthly basis, you've by far exceeded the 2K a month that you were going for. So in that respect, it's great. But there are issues with it as well. So the first one is, again, you need the cash to start with, a common theme. You need a large amount of capital to get started with a flip even if you're using a bridging loan or something like that. And if you are using a bridging loan, of course, you're taking on more risk. Even if you don't, there is still a lot of risk because you're basically taking a large amount of cash, let's say it's everything that you've got, and you're putting it all on a particular project. If you do that with a buy-to-let property, something we've talked about in the past is about how time is one of your best friends in property, because even if things don't go optimally, time tends to sort everything out. With a flip, you don't have that luxury. And of course, there's so much more that can go wrong with a project that can leave you not making any money or indeed making a loss. So you need to go all in straight away with all your cash, take on loads of risk on a project. If it doesn't go well, you've got a problem. If it does go well, that's great, but that is a one-off payment. So when we're talking about the previous strategies, you do build up income that you keep on getting paid every month. With flips, though, it's one-off. There is no recurring element. So it's more of a business than it is an investment. You're in the business of flipping property. But as a business, it's a really tough one to get into because you're making these one-time sales with loads of risk that involve tying up a large amount of capital. So again, like with all of these, flips can be great, but as a way to make money for most people, not so great.
So some of you may be thinking, well, I know the answer, and it's rent to rent, because that is the income generating strategy amongst property. And actually, out of everything we've talked about today, rent to rent probably is the way to make short-term income. And probably if you had to choose a property strategy and your focus was only making that 2k a month, and you were prepared to deal with what's needed to make that 2k a month, then I would say in terms of capital, it's the one that will get you there with the least invested. However, rent to rent is not easy. Now, rent to rent, if you don't know, it's a strategy where you will approach a landlord, so you don't own the property, and you will take it off them and pay them a level of rent. And then you will rent the individual rooms out for a higher amount in total if they are all let and you don't have any vacancies. And the difference that you make is the profit. So that's why there's not a lot of capital deployed to get into this strategy. The challenge you have, well, there's quite a few. The challenge that you have is that depending on the area and the type of property that you use for rent to rent, you're going to need anywhere from sort of 4 at the very low end to 10 to be able to make that 2k a month. So you have to find those properties. Now, finding a landlord who's willing to let you take their property and then individually rent their rooms out is no easy feat. There isn't a website for it where it's all listed and all the landlords are there just waiting to give you the properties. It's hard work. And that is a business endeavour in itself, sourcing these properties. And it'll take a lot of time. And then you'll need to spend money on marketing and networking. Your time investment is huge, arguably probably bigger than refurbs and flips, because you will have to be pretty much full time if you want to hit this goal in a reasonable time frame doing rent to rent. So you're basically giving yourself a full-time job to hit the 2k, where I'm sure for most people they could earn more than 2k a month through their own work. Now, that's just acquiring the properties. Once you've got them, you don't put your feet up and go, I've done it. You then have to manage them. And remember, you're not managing 4 to 10 properties because you will have multiple tenants in each and every one of those properties. So you will have dozens upon dozens of tenants that you have to manage and look after. That, again, is a job. And because you're renting rooms, it is more intensive. It's more transient as well. More people coming and going. So you have to constantly get those properties let. And remember, if you don't have enough let and there's too many vacancies, you could end up making a loss every month. So it's touted as the option for people who want to make income from property quickly without too much capital. Yeah, the capital part, fair enough, if you don't value your time. But if you value your time, then your capital deployment is huge. And the amount of time that you'll be giving means that you could probably be earning a lot more money from doing another job. You could probably work part-time and earn more than rent to rent, at least in the beginning. So as the one strategy in property that's probably best set up for you to make 2k a month, to me, it's a lot of hard work. And if I wanted to make 2k a month, it's not a strategy that would even get close to my shortlist of ideas.
Well, hasn't this just been the most negative episode of the property podcast ever? We've going through and slammed every major strategy. But remember, we're slamming them with relation to this one specific goal, which is achieving a relatively large amount of money per month in a short amount of time. But you know what? It's not just property. any kind of investment makes it very difficult to bring in that kind of money in that kind of time without needing to have loads of money to start with. Because investing is about taking money that you've already got and adding to it over time. And generally that is a long-term process. So rent to rent, like Rob was talking about, is actually the most suitable of all the strategies because it's not really a property investment strategy. It's starting a property business. And a business is a way of making money now. The others are all forms of investment, which means that you need to have money to invest in the first place. And then you need to allow time for those investments to play out. So property is still a great investment. It's just tough as a business. Any other investment would have exactly the same types of issues. If you wanted to invest in the stock market and make £2,000 a month, well, again, you'd either need to have loads of money to start with, so you could just invest it and then have the dividends pay out the money that you wanted, or you'd have to take on a lot of risk and use a lot of time to be implementing short-term trading strategies, which could get you to where you want to be more quickly, but also takes up a load of your time and takes on a lot of risk. That should sound quite similar to some of the things we've talked about in property. So, Rob, I think this is like the key distinction of the whole episode. The reason that property is a terrible way to make money is that property is an investment, and investments are a terrible way of generating money in the short term. But as an investment, property's great.
Yeah, to me, it's amazing. As an investment, property is absolutely brilliant. When you consider leverage, you consider how it hedges you against inflation, its track record, all the benefits that property brings. There's so many. And listen, we've done hundreds of episodes of the podcast where you can hear how brilliant property is. So we haven't changed our minds. It is absolutely brilliant. And that's why so many people, once they've created wealth, will then invest, because it is one of the best places you can put your capital to work. Alan Sugar, he made his money through Amstrad and other businesses, but then made just as much, if not more, through his investments in property once he'd made some capital. And he still invests in property today. Most of his investments are property related. I'm sure he does other investments as well. That would be a wise thing to do. But all his efforts in property investment are quite well documented. So you can find it for yourself by reading his book or doing research on him. But he gives it a lot of time and attention. And he's not the only one. So many other people who've created wealth then go on to invest in property. And a great book that you can read that sort of covers this as a concept, and I'd highly recommend it if you've not read it, ignore the cheesy title, is Millionaire Fastlane, which is written by MJ DeMarco. Really good book, highly recommend it. It's a bit like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but a bit more direct. A Rich Dad, Poor Dad for adults, if you like. So give that a read if you haven't already. But the concept is create money and then invest it in assets like property. So at the beginning of the show, we promised to give you some ideas of how to create 2K a month, if that's something that you wanted to do. And this is not going to be a podcast episode in itself. It's just a few quick ideas to get those creativity juices going and to give you some examples. But we've made it quite clear that the way to do it is through a business, and it's not through investment. So if you want to make money and you want to make it in a quicker time frame than just saving up or investing, then a business is the way to go. And before you groan and go, well, that's a full-time job as well, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be with business. In fact, I'd strongly encourage you, even if you want to be full-time in business, to start off on the side and part-time first so you can test ideas and build up this capital with less risk. So, Rob, we've teased it enough. Let's give some examples of how people could make 2K a month in a lot easier way than trying to do it through property.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that you can do this with property. Like we've looked at rent to rent, which is a property business. You can do that. But compared to some of the things we're going to talk about, it's pretty hard, and it's also quite difficult to fit around a day job, which, as you've quite rightly said, Rob, it's probably best to keep until you're in a more solid position with the business you're setting up. Doing flips and doing refurbs can also be a business, but it requires a lot of cash, or it involves going and finding cash off something else. The ideas that we're going to talk about don't require much in the way of cash. So I know that this episode will upset people, because people will say, no, you're wrong. I've done this. I have started out here and I have got to there. And yes, you completely can. We're not denying that. We're just saying it's the hard way of doing things. There are easier ways of getting to the same place. So, for example, you could start offering a service. What could that service be? It could be anything depending on what your skills are. It could be consulting for the industry that you've been in for years and you're super experienced in. It could be writing. It could be design. It could be absolutely anything. And you could start that with absolutely zero capital today, and you could sign a £2,000 a month contract tomorrow, and bang, you've achieved your goal. Of course, it very rarely is that easy, but the point is it's possible. You can do it with no money, and you can get there very quickly. The same is true for online businesses. So, for example, you could start an e-commerce store today with probably less than £100. You need very little in terms of capital. You don't need any stock because you can just drop ship it all. You can be up and running and making sales today. But that lack of capital isn't a barrier to you scaling to profits of £2,000 a month and far beyond. There will be plenty of people who fail to do that, but it can be done. And importantly as well, it tends to fit better around a day job than the property strategies that we've talked about. Because if you're going to be doing a flip, you're going to have people working on that property, even if you're not working on it yourself, and you're going to need to talk to them and supervise them during the day. Whereas e-commerce, you can do mornings and evenings. And there's a million other types of online business as well. So you can sell informational products where you're, rather than selling a service doing what you do, you sell the knowledge for how to do it, or you identify a problem that you have the solution to and you sell that. Again, you can get started with absolutely no money whatsoever, and your sales can be anything. It's unlikely you're going to get to £2,000 a month in your first few months because it's really hard. And with any of these businesses, there are skills that you need to acquire. But again, it's the same with property. You don't just go into property and start absolutely nailing how to do it from day one and executing flawlessly. It's the same with any of these businesses. It's the same thing, but the capital requirement isn't there and the timeline is naturally shorter.
So with ways to make 2k a month through business, you're really just limited by your imagination. Now, if you are struggling with that imagination, you can check out Noah Kagan, somebody we interviewed on the podcast many years back, someone we've mentioned on the podcast previously as well. He's got his own podcast and YouTube channel. But if you Google something like Noah Kagan Business Ideas, he's done multiple episodes on different types of ideas. Now, you don't need to copy those exact ideas. You can do if you want, but it gives you just even more ideas on top of what Rob's talked about there. Now, it's worth repeating, even though it's been said, that none of this is expected to be easy. Sometimes you're lucky, but most of the time it does require work. And there is no guarantee of success. But you can start and you can try. And with property, if you haven't got huge amounts of capital, you can't just start. You know, even with rent to rent, you're going to need some marketing costs and your time costs. So if you are mainly driven by the goal to make more money quickly in a short space of time, then property, as we've established, is not the way to go. But my word, once you've made a bit of cash, even just a bit, getting it into property is a great thing to do. And like I said before, you've got hundreds of episodes to back that up. It really is an amazing asset class. And that's why Rob and I use it for our own investments and wealth creation. It's an amazing wealth creation tool. It's not a great income producing tool, but for wealth creation, it's hard to beat.
Time now for Hub Extra, that part of the show where we give you a little bit more before we send you on your way. And you can get even more by signing up to the Property Hub's weekly newsletter, also called Hub Extra, which lands in your inbox on a Friday morning. So go to propertyhub.net if you haven't signed up for that already. Now, this week's Hub Extra is a little bit of a cheeky one because it's a way to share all the goodness of the property podcast with your friends and family. So we know that we're extremely lucky to have an incredible community. And whenever we launch something new, like we did with Portfolio recently, the support from our audience is amazing. We're so lucky to have so many great ambassadors out there. And that's because you get some value from the show and you introduce others. That is how we've grown over the years. The trouble with podcasts is it's not an easy thing to introduce someone to. If you're not a podcast listener, there's all these kind of annoying barriers to actually figuring out how to listen to a podcast and download it and everything in the first place. If you know people like that who'd get something out of the property podcast, but they're not podcast people, send them in the direction of Spotify. So Spotify have been expanding into podcasts a lot over the last couple of years. They've invested heavily in it. And, you know, we're not being paid by Spotify, so I'm not going to say that the listening experience is absolutely incredible, because it's not. It's fine. But if you listen to podcasts another way already, then keep doing it. But what it does do is make it really, really easy. Anyone can just open up Spotify, which they probably use anyway to listen to music, type in property podcast, click a button, and they're done. They can be listening without having to even really understand what a podcast even is. So if you do have people in your life who'd benefit from the Property Podcast, but you've failed to win them over so far, then get them to check out Property Podcast on Spotify. All they need to do, open up the app, search Property Podcast, and they're done. And while you're there instructing them how to do that, tap the little star icon. You can rate podcasts in Spotify now, which is a new feature. Again, it helps other people to discover the show. So if you could just give it a little tap while you're there, we'd really appreciate it.
We certainly would, and we'll appreciate it if you join us again on Tuesday for Ask Rob and Rob. And next week, of course, we'll be back. We haven't given up on property, despite today's title, for the Property Podcast. So until then, take care, have fun, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.